Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast welcomes Jekielek, an Epoch Times senior reporter and author of the new book, Killed to Order, China's Organ Harvesting Industry and the True Nature of America's Biggest Adversary. Jekielek, thank you for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
I'm so thrilled to be here. Thanks.
It's a very important book. I want to start with what is the essence of the American-Chinese relationship presently, just kind of an overview so we have a place to step off from.
We were in this, what you might want to call Kissinger doctrine of, maximum engagement from the U.S. side. So the viewpoint was kind of very asymmetrical, because on the U.S. side, there was this idea that we were going to liberalize China. We're going to turn them into a South Korea or a Taiwan by pumping lots and lots of cash in, sharing all our technology, changing the legal system by, educating them, all sorts of stuff, right? And we welcomed, hundreds of thousands of students here, which of course also paid a lot. So there was, on the U.S. side, there was a lot of goodwill. And for a few people, a lot of profit that was being made. The other side was, and this is something at the Epoch Times we knew very early on, because we were actually founded to challenge that grand narrative in a very real way. We knew they weren't liberalizing. We knew that they were actually killing people for refusing to give up their faith. They had these vast re-education and transformation systems that would kind of function to break people from their beliefs, right? And if your First Amendment protections are the equivalent are being systemically violated to the point that people are being killed, that country's not liberalizing. So the Chinese, under the Chinese Communist Party, China basically had this vision: we're going to use America and the West as much as possible. We're going to extract as much wealth and everything, right? They had a whole people that were actually, the dictator back in 1999, the way he rose to power in part was he was an expert at bamboozling, at sort of bringing in this, kind of convincing people of this false narrative. But Communist China always viewed America as its primary adversary, as an enemy, and they looked to abuse it and to use what's called unrestricted warfare to basically use various systems of our open society against us and build itself into the powerhouse it's become. And in the last decade or so, that has started to shift because, I think partially because of our work, but partially because people just got wise to it. At some point, you're like, hey, we helped you join the World Trade Organization, even though you didn't deserve it at all, right? And then all you did was abuse the systems of the World Trade Organization to attack us. That's weird. That's not a partner. I'm just giving an example, right? Mm-hmm. But there was just that same phenomenon was everywhere. President Trump was elected with China being an issue back in the day, and actually started acting on it and started challenging some of their kind of engagement rhetoric with this initial tariffs, which, a lot has shifted. And now, we kind of see how much leverage, like critical earths or most generic drugs, the ingredients are made. We have these existential pieces of leverage that China has over us under the Communist Party, and looking to kind of use those to keep the gravy train flowing from America, because they really need American and Western money. I hope that summarizes it well.
No, it does. It does very well. I do have a follow-up on that, though. You mentioned that Epoch Times and others affiliated could see this problem. Was the U.S. government, U.S. politicians knowing this and just ignoring it, or did they truly not see what was going on?
When I started at Epoch, this was like a 95-5 issue, okay? Left, right, Republican, Democrat, up, down, everybody really kind of believed the narrative, from what I could tell. gosh, I always forget this quote, but Mark Twain has this great quote, like when you're financially incentivized to not notice something, it's very hard to notice it. And I think there were bad actors. You have this situation, 1989, right? Tiananmen Square massacre. That should have been a major setback, right? Like if you're massacring 5,000 to 10,000 people in cold blood using your army, students, right? Hoping for democracy. That should have put a pause, right? But that's not what happened. And we know later, that the National Security Advisor Scowcroft traveled to Beijing and said, look, we're going to ride this out. And it's astonishing. Like, why would they do that? And I think it was because of this narrative. Again, remember, they were really good at bamboozling, so to speak, the Americans or just Westerners in general. I think more even than Americans. But there's this narrative, like they would say stuff like this. They'd be like, well, look, so that was the hardliners that did that, right? I'm one of the reformers. Let's work together. We wouldn't want those hardliners to get even more power, but actually there's a lot of us reformers and we're going to facilitate change, but don't make too many waves. If you make the waves, the bad kind of people that the hardliners, they're going to keep power. So work with us. And it's a very compelling narrative if you have a lot of money resting on making sure it's true, right? Yeah, I think that's why.
So let's go to what is so disturbing to contemplate. We have Annie's story, which you detail in the book. It's about harvesting organs from living people. I would imagine almost nobody in America is aware of this, or they probably wouldn't even believe it if they heard about it.
It's a crazy story. I mean, there were, back in 2005 and 2006, there were two kind of simultaneous whistleblowers that came out with information that was just shocking. On the one hand, it was Annie, and she was the wife, that's a pseudonym. She's still in hiding, actually. Her husband was a transplant surgeon who confessed to her that he had removed 2,000 corneas from living people. Okay, among other things. I mean, just crazy revelation, and that there was a camp that people were being held and then being used as these unwilling organ donors. So that was one allegation. And at the same time in Israel, there was a transplant surgeon who was the head of the Israeli Transplant Association at one point, a professor. He was a heart transplant surgeon. He had a patient that basically told him, hey, listen, I'm tired of waiting. I might die. I've got it set up in China in 2 weeks. My heart transplant scheduled in 2 weeks. So that in itself, just that one fact was a massive red flag, right? Yeah. And that red flag is basically scheduled. It means that there's a reason you can't schedule a heart transplant in an ethical scenario, because someone has to have a catastrophic accident that the ethics team decides they're not coming back from. So it's okay to take that person's organs. And then that person has to match you. So they have the blood type, the tissue type, the size, all of that needs to match. And that is rare when you add up all the different variables that need to happen. But here, you're scheduling it. So you're scheduling it means you're making someone dead. There's no catastrophic accident. So they would tell people in the early years that it was death row prisoners that were being used. But, even the wildest estimates of death penalty in China, we're orders of magnitude less than the number of transplants that were being done. The other part is this 2 weeks. And so remember, you have this, you have to have all these variables that match up, right, when that accident happens. That's why there's a mad rush. When you need that transplant, everybody's converging on a hospital and basically trying to, because you can't have a completely dead body, no circulation, then those organs degrade really fast. So you got to get people together and to facilitate transplant. Here, in 2 weeks, it's being done, and that's because, and this is the part that was the hardest for me to just grasp when it dawned on me. What they did was, back in 1999, they turned against a group called Falun Gong practitioners. And communist China has a history of creating these what are called a black class. Like at the beginning, it was landowners. They wanted to seize people's land. So they said, these are the black class. They put a lot of propaganda against those people, like a lot of really nasty things to kind of dehumanize them in the eyes of the population. And it was okay then to take their stuff, to take their land and kind of seize it and nationalize it. That in the 89, it was the students, as we discussed a little bit earlier. In 99, the new black class became Falun Gong practitioners. 70 to 100 million people practicing truthfulness, compassion, tolerance, very grassroots, unlike a lot of structures in China under communism. very, very top down. And what they did this. They dehumanized them. Okay, again, mass propaganda through the system. And then it turned out that these people, what was called re-educate very well. Because, by the way, when they attack these groups, it doesn't necessarily mean kill everybody. They use the term eradicate. Jiang Zemin, the dictator at the time in 1999, he said, eradicate the Falun Gong. It didn't mean kill everybody. It meant put them into the vast re-education transformation system. It meant break them, make them good, loyal communists, or at least performatively good, loyal communists. Make sure they don't follow it with their beliefs. But it turned out the Falun Gong were unusually resilient to this. But this is what created this horrible situation where kill to order was possible. That's the title of my book.
Yes.
So you have a dehumanized population. There's 1 million or 2 of them incarcerated because they're not re-educating easily, and they're actually torturing them in prison to try to break them and so forth. And some very evil person realizes, hey, wait a sec, we can monetize this. So they start blood typing, tissue typing, and organ scanning those people. And now they create a database of all of those vitals that you need, right? When that in an ethical system, it's happens by chance. Here, now you have a database, and when it's large enough, there's always a person that will match whoever comes in and pays the cash, and you ship and kill that person to order. That's the system they created, and it's grown to 60 to 90,000 transplants per year in communist China. Oh, it's a whole next level of extreme organ trafficking. And thank you for having the courage to talk about it.
Well, it's absolutely vile and very hard to comprehend the mentality that would allow for this. There was something else that I read in Annie's story, was not only were they taking these corneas and other body parts off of live people, but I guess when they were done with them, were they literally incinerating live harvesting victims?
Well, you can sort of imagine, like this is of course a terrible part of the story, which I don't often mention, right? Because the more kind of extreme you get, the more people start to turn off. When you dehumanize people, right? We have this quirk in our psychology that allows us to do terrible things, or at least allow for terrible things to be done to a group of people that's been deemed dangerous or lesser than us. We saw that in America's history of slavery, right? Like what can be done to people when we start believing once they're dehumanized through repeated rhetoric, and it kind of becomes part of the culture, so to speak. And in communism, they're expert at this. So this is an essential part of how you can get killed to order, because not everyone's a psychopath, right? They can't just kill people for organs casually. They have to kind of partially believe that these people somehow deserve it or just don't matter. Why would you leave any evidence if you're just treating someone like a material, like a tool, or just something else that you would throw out? It's not that hard to imagine that you would get rid of the evidence and you wouldn't really care how that happened. So that it's a terrible part of the story, that Annie's allegation. Unfortunately, that's in a way the punchline. Like a big part of the book is it explains how this horrible industry is in fact a perfect lens to understand the mind of the Chinese Communist Party, the sort of the mind of the governance of this. Everything is instrumentalized in this very cold, calculated way where raw power is really the only determining factor.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues in a moment with our guest, Jan Jekielek.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
ShillingShowMedia.com will take your project from conception to completion.
ShillingShowMedia.com is reasonably priced and highly professional.
Need a website for your business? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Need a video created or edited? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Have a photography or graphic design project? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
Visit ShillingShowMedia.com. That's ShillingShowMedia.com.
Get your fix. Schilling Show Unleashed.
We return now. The book is Killed to Order, Our guest is Jekielek. We're talking about what's happening in China that, it's being kept hidden, but they're exposing it through this book. I got to ask you this because we talk about the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. We know they're an authoritarian regime and they've been in control for a good while in China. But what about before the CCP? I mean, is there something in the essence of China itself that would tolerate this, or was it really just corruption of the Chinese by the Communist Party?
I think by and large, it's the latter. It's the corruption by the Communist Party. China has a very vibrant history, and it's the last few centuries are particularly difficult for it. And there were some governments which were, particularly noxious, frankly. Yes. There are also these incredible dynasties like the Tang Dynasty, which was incredibly open when they adopted Buddhism. And actually, Japan admired China so much that they, during the Nara period, where they basically just adopted a whole bunch of architecture, religion, everything, because they just saw what an amazing, and that was, by the way, an extremely open society. I mean, inherent to a lot of these kind of traditional vision of, let's say, even, Falun Gong practitioners, are practice something that's ancient, possibly even predates Buddhism itself, but was traditionally passed down like in an individual lineage, and this innate dignity of the human being, in fact, like necessity in a way. I mean, this is how I read the teachings, finding one's own path to the divine, to God, and like is sort of central, right? That kind of decision making that's central to our First Amendment in the U.S. So what communism, and this is like I write about this quite a bit in my book, is totalitarian, and it's actually very difficult for us to even understand. I didn't fully grasp the difference between authoritarian and totalitarian until like a few years ago, and I know more about it than a lot of people. And the big difference, for example, is that communism, especially under the Chinese Communist Party, they're extremely harsh on any form of civil society, because civil society, which is the thing that actually makes, when de Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America, the thing that he noticed, the thing that strikes me in that book the most, is he talks about how Americans have this amazing ability to just self-organize around issues that require attention, kick butt in those things. And This is what's going to make America great. And in fact, that's what happened. He was very prescient this way. Well, that exact phenomenon is what the Chinese Communist Party destroys. Okay, because that's how change happens. It's through that exact activity, through ideas, through innovation. They don't want that, because that challenges in communist China, the greatest good, the top value is the survival and supremacist of the Chinese Communist Party, the supremacy of the Chinese Communist Party. And anything that might challenge that in a meaningful way gets destroyed real quick. And it's another thing that it's just very difficult for us to grasp. But this kill to order, macabre industry, I think gives us a sense of why that might be, and that it indeed is the case.
We've heard the term medical tourism, and I know there's places in Costa Rica, Eastern Europe, etc., that provide perhaps good services at better prices than people could find in the United States. But I had no idea that this was going on in China, that they have medical tourism in essence, as you mentioned in Kill to Order, that people just go there and pretty much get what they want, like they're ordering off a menu.
It's wild. Like there's places like Thailand, for example, on the medical side, which just have like amazing quality doctors and medical services, and at a much better price. And you can go and get, you also get treated like a king, because it's very much a service culture. That all exists in communist China. The problem is this extreme instrumentalization of its own people, right? So like you can go and whatever, it doesn't matter that someone has to die for you to live. In fact, that's the system. I don't know if you remember, there was this hot mic moment, September, I think, where, I had an unbelievable revelation during that. My phone was buzzing off the hook. Just to remind people, it was Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Kim Jong-un observing a military parade in Tiananmen Square, and they get caught on a hot mic. And basically, she talks about how at 70, we're just babies, talking about them, right? The super elites, the leaders. And Putin says, unbelievably, through continual organ transplantation, perhaps we can achieve immortality. And then she responds, 150 years is our target. I mean, that's a paraphrase, but it's kind of, this was a revelation to me, because I've known for years they have this elite longevity project called Project 981. By some estimates, 10 years longer they live. I don't know if that's a real number, but that's what's alleged. I didn't grasp, of course, I knew about the forced organ harvesting for years, but I didn't understand. To get back to this tourist aspect, it was just kind of an unbelievable revelation, because a lot of Chinese don't believe that this was a real hot mic moment, that there's no way that Chinese Central Television would have allowed for the top leaders. Imagine the heads that would roll in that sort of a situation, right? A lot of Chinese believe that this was actually intentional. It was almost like an advertisement. Hey, if you want to work with us, then here's what we have to offer. And what they said, in effect, is we offer life, right? Of course, you have to have the unbelievably loose morals to allow people to die for that. Apparently, there are people that are willing to do that. And the Chinese super elites clearly are, as we have this, we're again, like I said, it's 60 to 90,000 transplants a year by our best estimate. It got harder and harder to actually figure out, like, the data. They keep hiding it better and better over the years. But the one thing that we do know is that the number of hospitals since that estimate was made has grown. And that's very clear. It hasn't gone away. And I mean, I think actually today, I have to share this. Over the weekend, my book hit like a number 111th book on all books in Amazon and bestseller rank, which was like, just unbelievable to me. I mean, unbelievable in a sense that it's been such a difficult issue to talk to people about, basically, for years, and just people wouldn't want to go there mentally. But it seems like today it resonates and people understand that this could be real, and they're willing to dig deep into it, like, in a whole book form, as in Kill to Order. So I feel like we're at this cusp of a time where we can shift this. This is one of these things where mass awareness actually gets it to end. Especially, ultimately, it has to be mass awareness amidst the Chinese population. When we start with mass awareness in the American population or the Western population, that will trickle in through the various forms. Like at Epoch Times, we have all sorts of firewall busting software we use all the time, which actually, anyone can use, but we try to get that information, like real, true information, to the Chinese people writ large.
Jan, in the book, you reference some attempts at legislation in the United States to at least address the problem best they can. So tell us what these efforts are, and do you think they will pass and be enacted?
Well, again, it's an amazing, unusual situation that we're in, where there's actually like multiple legislation. There's two pieces of legislation that have passed the House near unanimously. One is called the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act. That's kind of a general, you could call it like, it's something that is targeting forced organ harvesting in different parts of the world with a particular focus on China. That's a very strong bipartisan bill. It's in the Senate, can be brought to the floor. And a new one that just got reintroduced in a bipartisan fashion, it's called Falun Gong and Victims of Forced Organ Harvesting Protection Act. And that's Cruz and Markley, which just like 5 days ago, basically put this out. So we've got two pieces of legislation on the floor in the Senate that could be passed, could be sent to President Trump's desk. I think they need to reconcile this new Senate bill, the Cruz-Merkley one, with the House still, but close, right? And there's a third bill in the House, which is something that it's called the Block Act. Congressman Neil Dunn put that forward. And what it does is it says insurance, Medicare, Medicaid insurance can't pay for China transplants. And that's good legislation to have. In 2008, Israel enacted a law like that, which basically stopped people from going to China there. And there's multiple, around the evidence that we've gathered, there's all sorts of doctors around the world that have sent their patients to China to get transplants over the years. So it's a real huge problem. At the state level, there's 6 states that have passed legislation, kind of like this Block Act that I just mentioned. So there's 44 states to go, but model legislation is out there, and states are doing it. I'd have to check to see which ones are trying to get these through. But this is no brain. This is the most nonpartisan type issue you can possibly imagine, right?
As you reference, and I'm thinking, is there anybody who will oppose this legislation? And you would think it would be passed unanimously, but I've got to imagine there may be some who would vote no on it. Are they captured by the Chinese Communist Party financially, perhaps?
We're very powerful as individuals. Like 100 calls to a Senate office actually makes that Senate office really think about a bill, especially if it's one like this. Like if this gets brought to the floor, like any of these, either the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act, the Falun Gong and Victims of Forced Organ Harvesting Protection Act, or both, I don't think people are voting against these bills. I just don't think if they get to the floor. The question is, often a lot of these bills die by not getting to the floor. Mm-hmm. And so you can bet that the Chinese Communist Party is working really hard to not have these bills because, like, for example, this Protection Act, like it will establish in law, it asks the question, can you please determine whether this is an atrocity about under the Elie Wiesel Act, it's very important because of course the Communist China says, oh no, we're not doing anything like that. And like, well, how dare you? You're evil. And I mean, the main response is attack the messenger, right? Yes. But what this would do is, and if, I think a cursory assessment of this and the evidence, which is voluminous, would say absolutely it's an atrocity. Then we can have it as a matter of U.S. law that it's an atrocity. And I think that's powerful because a lot will stem from that. Like there'll be a lot less interest in cooperating with China. Like we do crazy things. We train some of those surgeons, right? Yeah. We have financial relationships. We have, we supply materials that are used for transplantation. I mean, not just in America, but also European countries. So like we should stop all that. That's not a good idea, right? And there's all sorts of things we can do to achieve that, but establishing it as a kind of position of the U.S. government, of an understanding that this is real, yes. Right? Which has kind of eluded us for the longest time, would be a powerful step forward.
Jan Jekielek, if people would like to get a copy of your new book, Killed to Order, or if they'd like to follow your work online, tell us the ways they can do that.
First of all, for the book, the easiest way to buy it is Amazon, killedtoorder.com. That takes you directly to the Amazon link. I'm so enthused. Maybe we can even make some of the big bestseller lists, and that will really raise the issue because a lot more bookstores will get it and so forth. So I'm very excited about that. You can also get your library to get it, your local library, or go to your local bookstore and ask them to get you a copy. Sometimes they'll get it. So that's just an amazing kind of part of it. You can find me on X. That's the main social media I use, at Jan Jekielek, JANJEKIELEK, and also, of course, theepochtimes.com. That's we're the fourth largest media by paid subscribers in America, and we would love to have you a subscriber because that's where the vast amount of our revenues actually comes from, our individual subscribers, and that's how we stay independent. Check out my show, American Thought Leaders. That's also on the Epoch Times and on YouTube. And I've been doing a lot of podcasts lately, and because I really want to get the word out. So thank you for having me on to do that as well here.
You've done a remarkable job on a very difficult topic. Thanks for having the courage, Jan Jekielek. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.